When most people think about Noah's flood, they think the story lasted 40 days and 40 nights. But that's only the rain. The flood itself lasted 370 days. 370 days sealed inside an ark, while the world outside disappeared beneath the water. This is over a literal year of isolation, locked inside a wooden hall, while a global cataclysm erased the world as they knew it. Think about the weight of that, day after day of drifting, with no radar, no weather forecast, no visible sign that the destruction had ended, and no way of knowing whether it ever would. How do you survive that emotionally? How do you keep your grip when there's nothing solid left to hold on to? The answer to that question changes everything about how we read this story. Here is the secret to Noah's stamina. He didn't rely on what he could see. He relied on what he had been told. Before a single drop of rain ever fell, God gave Noah a word in Genesis 6:18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark. You, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. That promise was spoken into clear skies long before there was any evidence that the flood was coming at all. Noah built the ark on the strength of those words alone, and when the waters rose and the silence set in, those same words were all he had left to hold on to. For 5 grinding months after the rain stopped, the Bible goes almost completely quiet. God isn't issuing new commands. The horizon offers nothing, and in that deep, stretching silence, it would have been easy, completely understandable, to wonder whether God had simply moved on. And then Genesis 8:1 arrives. Just 4 words. But God remembered Noah. Not because he had forgotten. In the Hebrew, the word is zakar, and it doesn't mean a sudden recollection, the way we might remember where we left our keys. In biblical usage, zakar often carries the idea of covenant faithfulness, remembered and acted upon. When God remembers, He is not recovering lost information. He is turning His attention toward His promises and moving in accordance with them. It is the same word used when God remembered Rachel and opened her womb. The same word used when He remembered His covenant with Abraham and sent Moses to a suffering people. When He remembered Noah, He sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. To be remembered by God is not merely to be recorded. It is to become the object of His faithful action. 5 months of silence, and heaven had been watching that entire time. Noah may have felt forgotten, but he was never forsaken. That is the hinge of the flood narrative. Everything before Genesis 8:1 is descent and stillness. Everything after it is restoration and movement. And it tells us something essential about the nature of God's faithfulness. It does not always announce itself while it is working. Often it works quietly beneath the surface, and then in God's perfect timing, it becomes visible. So here is what Noah's stamina was actually built on. Not on signs, not on new revelations, not on any visible change in the water level, but on the unshakable conviction that God who had spoken was also the God who remembers, the God who keeps covenant. But here's something else easy to miss. Notice how God invites Noah into the ark in the first place. In Genesis 7:1, God doesn't say, go into the ark. In the original Hebrew, he says, come into the ark. That is a massive theological difference. Go means God was standing outside, sending them into isolation. But come means God was already inside, waiting. When the door shut, Noah wasn't locked in alone. He was locked in with the Creator. The ark wasn't just a survival capsule. It was a floating sanctuary. And prayer was the visible thread holding the entire narrative together. In ancient Hebrew culture, prayer was never meant to be confined to a moment. It was a posture of life, a whole body orientation toward God, woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. For Noah, across those 370 days, that posture likely took three distinct forms. The first was prayer as relentless obedience. In the biblical tradition, faithful obedience is itself a form of worship, a living response to God that goes beyond words. Genesis repeats a striking phrase multiple times. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Picture what that looked like. You are sealed in a wooden vessel. The world outside is gone. You cannot see land. You cannot see any sign of hope on the horizon. And yet, every morning you get up and you do the work. Every scoop of grain carried to a restless animal. Every timber checked. Every leak patched. Every routine upheld. Each one a silent declaration. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I'm honoring the instruction you gave me today. That is obedience as worship in its most embodied form. And in those 370 days of silence, it was also Noah's most sustained act of prayer. The second was praying through the silence. The hardest stretch of Noah's journey wasn't the 40 days of roaring rain. It was the 5 months of drifting that followed, when the fountains had stopped, the rain had ceased, and God was no longer speaking new words. Noah's prayer in the season were not the petitions for fresh miracles. They were something harder, the slow daily work of holding himself together, of reaching back to the original promise when every visible circumstances told him nothing was changing. Faith did not mean Noah always understood what God was doing. It meant he trusted that the God who was doing it. That kind of prayer doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like endurance, but it is the most essential kind there is. The third was resting in the presence of the one already in the boat. We have already seen it in Hebrew, come, not go. God didn't station himself outside the ark as a distant supervisor watching the vessel drift. he was inside. The presence of God was the unseen atmosphere of that ship. And knowing that changes the nature of every prayer prayed within those walls. Noah wasn't crying out across a distance. He was speaking to someone already in the room. But the trauma didn't end when the doors finally opened on day 371. Imagine stepping out onto a silent, muddy, empty planet. Every city, every neighbor, every familiar face, gone. The world that existed before you boarded the ark no longer exists at all. You are standing on the ruins of everything you once knew. And then, not long after, a cloud begins to gather on the horizon. Think about what happened in the body at that moment. The mind doesn't stop to admire the weather. It remembers. Every darkening sky will carry the memory of what water had done, and the body would brace for it to happen again. The floor had dropped out once before. What was to stop it from dropping again? God knew this. So in Genesis 9, he meets their trauma, not with a lecture, but with a covenant of peace, and he chooses his signs with extraordinary care. In the original Hebrew, the word used for the rainbow is qeshet, which literally means a war bow, not a decorative ark, not a poetic image, a weapon, an instrument of destruction and death. But look at how God positions it in the sky. A drawn bow aimed its target, points downward toward the earth. God hangs his bow pointing upward toward heaven, away from humanity. He is taking the instrument of divine judgment, turning it away from us, and suspending it in the sky, where every eye can see it, aiming it at himself. He was telling Noah's terrified family something that no amount of reassuring words could fully communicate. Look up. The warfare is over. You can breathe now. We all know what it is to watch a storm cloud gather. We might be in that place right now. A season that feels like it has no end. Financial pressure that would not let up. A relationship that has broken in ways you don't know how to fix. A health diagnosis that reordered everything. An anxiety that sits on your chest when you wake up in the morning. You look at the horizon and you can't find the edge of it. And you feel perhaps more than anything else, the heavy silence of God. In that silence, the hardest question isn't, when will this end? It is, has he forgotten me? Hear this. The same God who remembered Noah remembers you. The car that turned God's covenant faithfulness toward a man sealed in a wooden heart on a flooded earth is the same the car that sustains his people today. He has not looked away. He has not moved on. He has not forgotten what he has promised. You may not yet see what he's doing, but Noah couldn't see it either. When God remembered Noah, the waters did not disappear instantly. The ark did not immediately reach dry ground. The circumstances changed gradually, but the turning point had already come. God was already at work, and if you belong to Him, the same is true for you. When you are in that place, do what Noah did. Stop trying to navigate the waves on your own and start anchoring yourself to the promise. God's promise does not mean you would not face the water. Isaiah 43:2 says it plainly, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you." Notice it says when, not if. The storm is not a sign that the promise has failed. It is the very context in which the promise is kept. The guarantee of your survival is not your own strength or your own clarity. It is the presence of the one already in the boat with you. So if you are struggling today, do the next faithful thing. Feed what needs feeding. Repair what needs repairing. Show up where God has placed you today. Tend what has been entrusted to you. Trust the promise you were given before the storm came. And remember, the safest place to be is not on a calm sea. It is in the storm with God. Ultimately, Noah's story is a shadow, and every shadow points toward something more real than itself. Noah had to live entirely by a future promise, but we get to look back at a finished reality. Remember the qeshet, the war bow hanging in the sky. A bow without an arrow is a declaration of peace. But the rainbow leaves us with a question. If God's bow has been hung up, if judgment has been turned away, what happened to the arrow? Human rebellion did not disappear when the flood waters receded. Sin survived the flood because sin lived in the human heart. Judgment still had to fall somewhere. The debt was still owed. On Good Friday, the sky turned dark once again, a darkness that must have felt to those watching like the world was ending. But this time, the arrow of God's judgment was finally released, and it didn't strike us. It struck Jesus on the cross. He stepped into the storm of the divine wrath, absorbed its full force, and took the brunt of it so that we could walk out free. The rainbow in the sky is a sign that depends on conditions of crowds, real, faithful, and beautiful, but atmospheric. The cross is our permanent, unweathered rainbow, a covenant sealed not in moisture, but in the blood of Christ. It does not fade when the sky clears. It does not require the right light to be visible. It stands. Noah's very name means rest, and yet he could never find permanent rest for his soul. He pointed toward something he could not himself possess. Jesus is the fulfillment of that longing. He is the true Emmanuel, God with us. He entered the whole of human suffering, carried the weight of the storm all the way to its end, and walked out of the grave, victorious, and who says to you today, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The arrow of judgment has been spent. The weapon has been hung up, and the ark is open. Romans 10:9 tells us exactly what stepping inside looks like. That if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That is the threshold. Two things: believe and declare. To believe that Jesus died for your sins, to believe that he rose again, and to surrender to him as Lord. Not a long religious checklist, nor years of getting yourself ready, just the honest movement of heart that has finally stopped trying to navigate the flood alone and stepped inside. If it is you today, say it out loud if you can. Tell him you believe. Tell him he is Lord. The door is open. He's already inside, waiting, and he will carry you to the other side.